psychology and anthropology here at the University of Regina. My presentation for you today is titled A History of My Selfie. So please everyone, I know this is kind of against the rules, but get your phone out. And I want us, I'm gonna do it too, but everybody please just take a selfie, and not just not like a terrible one or anything, like really get it. Actually, I wanna get in it. Oh, well, can you flip it around? I used to do it.
I can do it like this.
There you go.
Okay.
There we go. So now you guys keep doing this, and I did it, so you have to. So while we do that and take a simultaneous selfie, all of you, I'm going to kind of set the stage here. In 2013, a columnist for The Atlantic argued that the moral panic over selfies is nothing new. It's just a recycled outrage. Throughout history, every time a new form of representation became more accessible, people dismissed it as shallow or dangerous. In the 1920s, when pocket mirrors became widely available, women were judged as vain or immoral if they dared to use one in public. So this moral outrage was about class access. Tools of self-representation were no longer just confined to the elites. The same thing happened with selfies. What some might call dishonesty might be better understood as class anxiety over democratization. Everyone, not just the wealthy who could afford portrait commissions, can now curate their image. So think about so-called low art, graffiti, or street art, forms that were critiqued precisely because they were available to the masses. In contrast, high art is what you'd find in museums, galleries, or even academia. But why do we even call it low? Because it was tied to the lower classes? And why do we call it high? Because elites assigned it more cultural and aesthetic value? I want us to pause here. Who has historically been in charge of writing down those values? And how might things have looked different if other people, like women, the working class, or marginalized groups, been in charge instead? If we consider that the selfie is a historical form of the self-representation, who gets to decide its value now? So this leads me to my research questions for today's presentation, which are threefold. First, how has the selfie come to be through the history of art? Second, how far back in time can the roots of a selfie be traced? And third, am I shallow for taking selfies? Because you see, this idea actually came to me in Paris in 2014, about halfway up the Eiffel Tower. I did what most of us would do, and I took a selfie, and you can see it on the left there. But at that same time, a woman standing near me came and took a picture of me, offered to take a picture of me as well, and at that point, I valued her image much more than my own. Now the funny part is that years later, all I could find is a blurry version of the image that she took of me. So let's pretend for a moment that it's in focus. But which of these two photos do we think is better and why? Because both images were made in the same spot, just minutes apart. Same me, same Eiffel Tower, and yet there's a clear difference in how I personally value them. And that difference is part of what I want you to consider today, the value that we place on images of ourselves. And that's why I'll spend the next 13 minutes talking to you about history, about self-representation, and about selfies, because I'm a millennial after all. So now that we've thought about what gives art its value, let's step back and ask what even is a selfie, and how does it fit into the history of art self-representation? The word selfie itself only entered popular vocab in the early 2000s. Oxford Dictionaries named it the word of the year in 2013. But of course, people were doing this long before that word existed. A selfie is usually quick, networked, and meant to circulate instantly, while a self-portrait is often more crafted and introspective. But both belong to the same long tradition of using technology to hold onto an image of ourselves. So think ancient coins with emperors' faces pressed onto them, or royal portraits through the ages. Selfies are more like an example of an individual's artistic expression, which is not inherently a shallow act by any means. During the COVID-19 pandemic, digital self-representation expanded, from Zoom profile pictures to drawing from live models online, creating new forms of connection and curated presence. I myself took online drawing classes over Zoom, where I practiced figure drawing a drag king in lingerie. Platforms like Snapchat show that not all self-representation is meant for permanence, and so the selfie reflects play, experimentation, and the temporary nature of our identities. Historically, we have to consider the fact that this temporary representation has been done before, meaning that it no longer exists for us to see today. Profile pictures operate as curated performances of identity, signaling group belonging, professionalism, or individuality, not unlike portraiture traditions, as we will see. The much ridiculed duck lips and the early 2000s MySpace angles were examples of how young people experimented with this self-curation. And of course, curation is something everything from your grandpa to your neighbor's chihuahua probably does. So if we look a little further back, we'll talk about the mirror. And the mirror changed everything. Before mirrors, your self-image depended on reflections in water, in metal, or what others told you. With the invention of the mirror, suddenly you could see yourself directly with a new precision that was entirely new. For the first time, people could stage and curate their appearance in private, long before the camera and long before our selfie. The very first mirrors were made of polished stone, usually obsidian, and seem to have originated in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, around 6000 BCE. Before that, the only way humans could catch sight of themselves was in the fleeting, distorted reflection of water. So mirrors weren't just a tool, they were a revolution in self-awareness. They gave people the chance to see, to adjust, and to imagine themselves visually. Artists like Frida Kahlo spent long periods separated from others, often confined to bed after surgeries. She turned to the mirror as both a tool and a companion, using it not just to reflect herself, but to reflect on herself. Through the mirror, she created paintings that were surreal in their introspection, layering pain, identity, and symbolism into the images. And of course, I couldn't leave out Vincent, because he painted more than 30 self-portraits between 1886 and 1889, using himself as his own sitter, because it was cheaper than hiring models. He used self-portraiture to study colors, brushwork, and emotion, and they were as much exercises in technique as they were in his own identity. Many of Van Gogh's self-portraits were painted for his brother Theo, serving as a way of keeping in touch and sharing his progress as an artist, quite like Snapchat or TikTok. And sometimes artists got more playful, creating characters and expressions that feel surprisingly similar to us today. Our friend here, Rembrandt, introduced us to the character behind the portrait, before the modern selfie came into play. Artists were already fascinated by experimenting with faces, but in the Dutch Golden Age, Rembrandt and following artists created what they called tronies. These works were about exploring faces free from the regular rules of patronage, and artists often used themselves as the models. Rembrandt's self-portraits are a perfect example of this. And some people call this guy, Joseph de Croo, the original meme lord. This man portrayed himself in all sorts of movements, showing a deep interest in expression rather than vanity. And that's basically like doing an 18th century duck face, I think, in some of those, isn't it? These portraits weren't stiff or idealized, they were playful and even performative. So when people actually accuse millennials or Gen Z of being uniquely self-obsessed, history tells us a very different story. Artists have been using their own faces as raw material for centuries. As Nicholas Mirzoff reminds us, the selfie does not rupture from the tradition of self-portraiture. Rather, it expresses, it develops, expands, and intensifies that long history. The medium has changed, but the impulse hasn't. Even a couple hundred years earlier, in the Renaissance, people were sneaking themselves into their commissions. And so on the left, we have the School of Athens, and on the right is the Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel, but these don't look like self-portraits, do they? If my computer wants to go forward. They are. You can see that Raphael is the second one in on the right in the left-hand photo, and Michelangelo is the flayed skin that St. Bartholomew is holding, which is extra cute. On the right, you can see Caravaggio is Goliath's head, and on the left, we have the OG elf on the shelf, Paul Gauguin, sitting there. And of course, we all know that you can see Jan van Eyck's reflection in the convex mirror in his masterpiece, the Arnolfini portrait. But I digress. And now, for the sake of time, we're going to jump back about 30,000 years before the Common Era. The term Venus figurine is a broad one. It's applied to Upper Paleolithic statues of women dating from around 50,000 years ago to 12,000 years ago, and sometimes stretches even further to cover female figurines from non-literate cultures that are well into our Common Era. One of the famous examples is the Venus impudica, which you see on the left-hand side there. It was discovered in 1864, and it's a small ivory figure, only 8 centimeters tall. It's headless, footless, and armless, but it has a strongly defined vulva. The name impudica was given in contrast to the later sculpture, which is like the Aphrodite of Knidos, who's standing in the pudica statue form. Okay, So you can hear the male gaze at work in their names, labeling them as Venuses, frames these figures through male concerns of sexuality rather than their possible other cultural meanings. But what we do know is that these figurines were found across a wide geographical range, the most widespread form of prehistoric art. And they've been linked to ritual, identity, and even health, possibly serving as a way for women to inspect their own bodies for coitus and hygiene and childbirth. Many were discovered in female graves, hinting at a deep connection between self-image, gender, and social status. But look at the proportions of these figurines. The large breasts and abdomen and the tiny or absent feet, the lack of a detailed face. For a long time, scholars called these distortions, symbolic exaggerations of fertility or sex. But Catherine McQuaid and Leroy McDermott argued something very different. They noticed that these proportions actually match the distortions a woman sees when she looks down at her own body. Breasts and belly foreshortened and feet barely visible, faces completely unseen. In other words, these might not be fertility symbols at all. They could be literal self-portraits. Without mirrors, a woman would never see her own face in this context, so it's ignored or minimized compared to that of a modern self-portrait, which focuses almost entirely on her face because we have mirrors and cameras. This flips the assumption that prehistoric art was created only by men, and it suggests that women are active image makers recording their own bodies, a radical rethinking of who is participating in the creative life of prehistory. So here's something you probably don't think about every day. The vast majority of people in human history have never been visually represented in any lasting form. The privilege of preservation, of having your likeness remembered through portraits or sculptures or paintings, belonged almost exclusively to the upper classes who could afford to commission their memory. So when we look at selfies today, we have to recognize what has changed. The selfie represents an absolute radical shift in access. For the first time in human history, ordinary people, not just kings and queens and saints, can preserve themselves visually on their own terms. So this slide doesn't represent the minority, but actually the majority of people. Beyond class, some other reasons for the lack of representation are the cost of materials, expertise in a form of artistry, cultural restrictions. For example, some sects of Judaism and Islam do not represent the person in an image. And access to literacy. Most people had no access to even paper or any other way to record. And of course, there's archival biases, because even where representation did exist, what survives in museums and history books is overwhelmingly reflective of the powerful, not the everyday person. So that was our quick little trip back in history, but now let's get back to today and see if we've answered our research questions. So how has the selfie come to be through the history of art, and how far back in time can the roots of a selfie be traced? The selfie has deep historical roots. It isn't a shallow modern invention, but part of a long lineage of self-representation, from Paleolithic Venus figurines to mirrors to artists like Van Gogh, Rembrandt, and Kahlo, all the way to anybody who owns today's camera phone. Selfies challenge elitist ideas of art and representation. Just as mirrors and pocket portraits once democratized self-representation, selfies expand access beyond elites. What critics call vanity often reflects class panic, discomfort that everyone can now author their image. And so, final question, am I shallow for taking them? No, I don't think so. Selfies are not inherently shallow, they're artistic, they're playful and identity building, and they continue the tradition of self-portraiture and experimentation that we've come to today. They allow ordinary people to preserve themselves visually, something denied to most of humanity through history. So take a look at that selfie that you took about 15 minutes ago, and I hope you value it a little bit more now. I'm gonna look at mine really quick, because I didn't actually, oh, that's not the one, but that's a good picture of me too. So in the end, it doesn't matter whether my Eiffel Tower selfie is technically better or worse than the one that somebody else took. What matters is that I took it, that I was able to choose how to represent myself. And across thousands of years, from mirrors to mosaics to memes, people have been trying to do exactly that. The selfie isn't an end point, it's the next chapter in an old, ongoing story of how humans make themselves visible. Thank you.